Okay, another way that we use, another mechanism used to nominate candidates for public office is a caucus. You don't find too many caucuses anymore. Typically what we find, the purpose of the caucus is to be used as a process to help select delegates to the National Convention for the selection of a presidential candidate. I'm going to talk more about that in just a second. When we look at presidential elections, you really need to distinguish between two steps. We have the nomination and the general election. The nomination, or the nomination process, is the mechanism by which a party selects a candidate who will represent that party at the general election. The general election is where the voters will decide who will receive the public office, who will become the elected official. So the nomination, or naming of a candidate, is a process by which a party selects someone to wear their label to represent that party at the general election. Whenever we look at presidential elections, the nomination and the general election each have different strategies that you have to have in place to be able to win. The strategy for the nomination is not the same strategy to win the general election. And students will frequently confuse the strategy to win one with the strategy to win the other. So you really need to make sure that you keep each one separate. So let's look at presidential nominations. The nomination of a president is going to happen at something called the National Convention. The National Convention of a party will take place once every 4 years. It'll last about a week. At the National Convention, individuals known as delegates will gather together, and there's several thousand of them for each party. They'll gather together and cast their votes for a nominee for president. Most all of these delegates are not free agents. They are pledged to a certain candidate. So when they show up at the National Convention, they must vote in accordance with who they have promised to vote for. So it is possible that you will know the outcome. In fact, it is likely that you'll know the outcome of a national convention before the national convention is even met, simply by counting up the number of pledged delegates from each state to that convention. So when we think about presidential nominations, then, the thing that you want to think about is, how are these delegates pledged? How are they allocated to different candidates? There's two primary ways in which these candidates are pledged. They're pledged as a result of a caucus, or they're pledged as a result of a primary, or officially known as a presidential preference primary. Most every state uses either one or the other, except for Texas. To the best of my knowledge, are the only state that uses both. So in Texas, some delegates are pledged as a result of the caucus, some are pledged as a result of a primary. Again, most states will use one or the other. The first two presidential contests, caucus or primary, happen in Iowa and New Hampshire. In Iowa, they're going to have caucuses, and that's the first contest that occurs. Now, what happens during a caucus is individuals show up at a local location, such as a school, a firehouse, a church, maybe even someone's living room, and they sit down, they discuss politics with one another, and at the end of this meeting, then they vote, and as a consequence of that vote, delegates are allocated. Without elaborating in great depth or going into the mechanics of the process, you simply should know that as a result of these thousands of local meetings that will take place in Iowa on a given night, caucus night, the delegates that will be selected months later are allocated proportionally. And proportional allocation is actually what both parties do. More on that in a second. So in Iowa, to participate in selecting your party's presidential nominee, you have to go to this meeting. You must sit there and openly discuss politics with your neighbor, perhaps your employer, perhaps your religious figure, and that has a tendency to affect who will participate. Usually what we find for caucus participants is they tend to be further to the left and further to the right than the average primary participant, and the average primary participant is even further to the left or further to the right than the average party member. So for someone to really participate in a caucus, they tend to be true believers in their party. About a week or so later, you typically will have the next contest, and it is a primary, and it happens in New Hampshire. And during a presidential preference primary, members of the party show up at their usual polling place, wherever they tend to vote for other officials, and they go in and they mark their ballot who they prefer for their presidential nominee, and they drop it in the ballot box, and that's about the end of it. Depending upon the line that's there, total time commitment is about 10 to 15 minutes. Again, even though it's a pretty low commitment or low stressful, low stress event. Doesn't take a lot of time. You still will find people. You'll still find that turnout for a primary is going to be lower than it would be for a general election, and the people that do show up tend to be more committed to their party than the average voter. Iowa and New Hampshire are also significant in that they are the first contests. The fact that they are first tends to have a limiting effect on everybody else. Imagine, if you will, since Iowa and New Hampshire are the first ones, you might have 5, 6, 7 candidates on either side of the aisle, either party, running for president, and they've been and camped out in Iowa and New Hampshire, going back and forth probably for months. And all of a sudden, Iowa has its caucus, and a little bit later on, New Hampshire has its primary, and you might have several candidates that have an incredibly poor showing in both Iowa and New Hampshire. Well, there's no rule against those candidates continuing. There's no law against the candidates continuing for their campaign. However, what will happen is if a candidate shows poorly in both Iowa and New Hampshire, they're pretty much out of it because nobody's going to give them any money. Their ability to fundraise goes down dramatically. And so in that manner, we look at Iowa and New Hampshire as kind of having a filtering effect on everybody's choices. Using a sports analogy, you can think of them as qualifying rounds. You don't win a tournament in the qualifying round, but you sure can lose the tournament in a qualifying round. Iowa and New Hampshire will select delegates just like pretty much every other state will, but if you come in last place in Iowa and New Hampshire, or second to last place, it's going to be incredibly difficult for you to continue. So in essence, you have lost the nomination. Just because you come in first place in Iowa and New Hampshire doesn't mean that you come in first place someplace else, but it does mean that it's going to be possible for you to continue. There's another vocab term you should be familiar with. It's called front-loading. Front-loading is the process of moving your state's presidential contest, a caucus or a primary, earlier in the sequence of events to make your state more important. The states that have their contest earlier tend to be more important than the states that have their contest last. The last state that has its contest probably won't matter. The reason why it won't matter is somebody will probably already have a majority of pledged delegates and will be almost declared the de facto nominee. Even though the National Convention hasn't met to make that official, that's probably what will happen. So if somebody already has the nomination of somebody already has a majority of the pledged delegates, it really doesn't matter what happens after that. So the states that go first tend to have a bigger impact than the states that go last. So once states figure this out, they tend to try to put their contest earlier and earlier in the cycle. If we look back about 40 years, most contests took place in March. Now we see a lot of contests taking place in February. So this process of front-loading has been moving these contests earlier and earlier. The delegates that are allocated from each state are typically done proportionally. Now, it's difficult to get much more specific than that because each party has its own set of rules, and then each party in each state has its own set of rules. So you're dealing with over 100 sets of rules because all 50 states, 2 parties, plus various U.S. territories, both parties give votes to Puerto Rico, District of Columbia, and so on. So you've got over 100 different set of rules that make it difficult to talk more specifically about how delegates are allocated. But generally speaking, delegates are allocated proportionally, meaning if you got 25% of the vote in a state, you'll receive roughly 25% of that state's delegates to that party's national convention. There are thresholds to kind of keep out the riffraff. If you don't cross the threshold, you don't get any delegates. It should be noted, however, that until recently, the Republicans did not use proportional delegate allocation or proportionality. They used a winner-take-all system, where you would either receive all of the delegates from that state or none of them. And this had the effect of producing a front-runner rapidly. The Democrats have historically always used proportional delegate allocation, and now both parties use some variation of proportionality. At the National Convention, the delegates will assemble, and then they will begin to vote. Typically, we will know who the winner will be because somebody almost always walks in with a majority of pledged delegates. So it's simply a matter of assembling casting the vote to make that person officially the nominee of that party. Also at the National Convention, the convention has to officially nominate a candidate for vice president. Usually what you'll see is they'll nominate whoever their presidential nominee wants. The presidential nominee will typically offer the vice presidential running mate slot to someone in an effort to attract votes or balance the ticket. If your candidate tends to be from the more conservative wing of the party, you offer it to someone who's a little bit more liberal. If your candidate is viewed as an outsider, you might offer it to someone who's viewed as an insider. Then there's regional balance considerations: north, south, east coast, west coast, central part of the United States. The long and the short of it is you're offering the vice presidential nomination to someone in an effort to gather votes. You're not looking for someone to be assistant president. You're looking for someone that might help strengthen the ticket and make it more attractive to voters. There's been some research on this, and there's not a lot of evidence that a strong vice presidential candidate helps the ticket. However, a weak vice presidential candidate can absolutely hurt the ticket. So kind of the first rule of being a vice presidential nominee is do no harm. There are a group of individuals at the National Convention that are known as superdelegates on the Democratic side, and there are a number of these individuals. And these are party officials, national elected officials, and they get to vote at the National Convention simply by virtue of the fact that they have a high party office or a national office in the U.S. government. So they get a vote at the National Convention. The thought process was in creating these superdelegates was that if the party National Convention doesn't have someone with a majority, these superdelegates would be able to throw their support behind someone, probably the person who has the best chance of winning, in an effort to prevent a floor fight at the National Convention. The Republicans do have something very similar to superdelegates. They're just not called that, and there are a lot fewer of them, so they don't make quite as big a splash as the Democratic superdelegates do. The demographics of the delegates for both parties tend to be dissimilar to party members. The delegates themselves tend to be further to the left if they're a Democrat or further to the right if they're a Republican. The delegates also tend to more strongly identify with their party, not just ideologically, but in terms of supporting its programs. Please remember, parties are not always ideological. The delegates of both parties tend to be better educated than the average party member. They tend to be older than the average party member. Then they are more likely to be white than the average party member. So the demographics of the delegates don't reflect the demographics of the rank and file party members.